have seen this video circling around on the internet recently. It's been sent to me a lot lately. The thing that really surprised me was I did the same thing that pilot did, which initially caused the pod strike. I just had a different result. Check this out. First, I want to say thank you to the plane spotters who spend hours outside in order to get these shots. It's something that I could never do. One, because I don't have the patience, and two, because I'd probably be extremely sunburned. But it's very rare to see these pod strikes, so it's really cool to have the videos to break these down. One of the problems that's going to make this video a little bit harder is that it starts right here. And so you don't really see if the airplane is coming in at a crab, meaning it's landing at an angle. So it's going to be a little bit harder because the angle where they shot it and because of where the video actually started. But you'll notice here that either the right wing is going up or the left wing is going down. When you're dealing with a crosswind landing, there's two possible scenarios of what could go wrong. You have one scenario where the wind comes in, and let's say it's coming from the right-hand side, and you don't put enough aileron correction in to keep your wing level with the ground. So there's one scenario where the wind actually will come underneath and push the right wing up, driving the left wing down. That's one scenario. The other scenario is that the pilots will actually correct into the wind, but do it too much. So in this case, if you had a wind coming from the left-hand side and the pilots were to overcorrect and push too much of the aileron in, the plane wings are still functioning just like a wing. So if you do that, you're going to drive that left wing into the ground. There's two possible scenarios, and since I can't really see the earlier part of the clip to see what direction the wind is coming from, it's hard to know. Here's the problem. Before the engine even hits the ground, the main issue is how hard they impacted the ground. That is not a normal descent rate on touchdown. I myself am guilty of having firm landings. Sometimes they're intentional and sometimes they're not. Situations where you might see a pilot have a firm landing, let's say the runway is really short, you don't want to be having a smooth landing, you're just trying to get the plane down on the ground exactly where you want to be and stopped in time. That's all you care about, not how smooth it is. Or in a very strong crosswind, again, you're just going to try to put the plane down on the ground. You're not going to flare it out and try to make it as smooth as possible because you can get drifted off the runway. So there are some scenarios that you'll see pilots do that. Another one will be if there's a lot of snow or water or something that's contaminating the runway. You don't want to get on there and grease it, because if you grease it, your plane could start hydroplaning or catching on the ice. So there are scenarios when you want to land firm, but there's no scenario where you want to land this firm. You'll notice as the plane comes in, at no point do they really start to flare until right before the wheels touch the ground. Now every pilot lands their planes a little bit differently. On the 747, for me, around 30 feet, I start my flare. Some do it later, but the problem is that if you flare too close to the ground, what will happen is you'll drive your gear into the ground. As you notice, they were coming in, there was no flare that was going on, and then there was a slight flare right before touchdown. And if you pitch your nose up, what's going to happen is you're going to drive your gear down. And that works out okay at 30 feet because there's 30 feet before your wheels are hitting the ground. But at 5 feet, you're just driving your wheels straight into the ground. So it takes a hard landing and makes it harder. Once a pilot drives the gear into the ground, it looks like it actually starts to bounce up. And again, either the right wing is coming up from the wind or the pilot is correcting and putting the left wing down too much. But either way, it's very dangerous, especially when you see the nose gear coming down like this. Up on the flight deck, this is all happening very quickly. There was a scenario when I was very new as a pilot. I was coming in and I was still trying to work out all the different scenarios of how much flare to give, what's too much, what's not enough, because if you flare too much, your plane can start floating. You don't do enough and it can be kind of a hard impact. So I was still trying to figure that out. And what I ended up doing is at 30 feet, when I normally flare now, at the time, I just did a little bit. I didn't flare enough. And the captain said, flare, flare. And I ended up flaring, and the touchdown was pretty firm. I was still trying to figure out my zone. The thing is that if I had really flared hard when the second time that he said flare, I would have probably done this exact same thing and drove the gear into the ground. It all happens, the countdown sounds something like 30, 20, 10, and then you're on the ground. So if you hear 30 and you're watching the other pilot and they don't flare, you're thinking, okay, at 20 they're going to flare. No flare at 20. So by the time you say flare, by the time they interpret or listen to that, think about what they're going to do. They could be 5 feet off the ground, driving the gear into the ground and making it worse than if you just really just planted it on there. If you just plant it on there, which I have done, not that firm, but I have done, if you just plant it on there, like on a icy runway, it's going to be fine. Or a very short runway, you're going to dissipate that energy, kill that energy, and push it into the ground instead of pushing it forward. So had the pilot not flared at 5 feet, it would have been better than what they actually did here. The problem is that the wing started to get crooked and then the nose started to go over. You've heard me talk about porpoising, where the plane is going up and down the runway. It is terrible. That's a really good way to create a very bad accident. So the nose starts to go over, the engine's hitting the ground. There's nothing good about what's going on here. So the pilots did the right thing. They executed the go-around and went back up and tried it again. Take a look at this video here. You see how the nose goes up about 30 feet off the ground? That is what you want to see. Compare that to this Cargolux video where you see the nose doesn't come up at all until right as the gear is about to hit the ground. Now that second 747 video, they did something extremely stupid after the fact. We're going to talk about it in a second here, but I wanted to show you kind of the difference. The one with the flare, you can see it smooth. The plane's going to slow down. It slows the descent rate because you're coming down maybe about 800, 900 feet per minute, and you want to slow that down to like 200 or 300 feet per minute, and that makes it nice, smooth landing. So you saw that flare, that's what it creates. If you don't do that, you're coming down at 900 feet a minute, you don't change anything, and boom, you hit the ground. Now, if you do that too hard, the plane will bounce up in the air, and now you need to do a go-around. You saw the spoilers come up, which are the things that actually helps the plane slow down on the ground, it's not ideal, but as soon as you put the power forward, they go down and you can do a go-around again. The only time you can't do a go-around is once you put the thrust reversers out. So this thing went very sideways, but the pilots made the right choice. The thing is that as a pilot, you can make these mistakes. I've had very firm landings. I've never bounced a 7.4. I haven't had a pod strike, but give me time. I seem to want to make all the mistakes on my own instead of learning from other people. But these pilots, even though they had a bad day, they had the pod strike, they almost hit the nose down first, started to porpoise, but it doesn't look like they did, and it looks like they got back up in the air again, and they came around and fixed it. The thing is you can take a pilot like that, who's really messed something up, had a bad day, and train them and get them back and on schedule, doing everything the way they're supposed to do, get their confidence back. You can do that. The thing you can't do, or things you shouldn't do, is take a pilot who's making bad choices. This wasn't bad choices. This was misunderstanding of the situation, lack of training, or unless they have a habitual history of doing terrible landings. But if it's just a one-off, that happens. It happens to every pilot. It doesn't happen to every pilot that it gets recorded and ends up on YouTube, but it happens to a lot of pilots that they make mistakes. So that being a mistake, that can happen. This second video is not a mistake. It's actually a really terrible decision. Check this out. So just like the pilot in the first video, I've had a very firm landing. Again, not so hard that it bounced. It felt like it should have bounced, but it didn't, which lets me know this pilot really slammed it in. However, in this video, I have also done the same thing. Not on the 747, just in case my boss is watching. I have not done that on the 747. And that was because I learned something earlier in my aviation career when I was doing the exact same thing that this pilot is doing, that I now stopped me from ever doing that. Here's the problem. Right here, the nose of the plane should be coming down, and you can see it wants to come down, but the pilot pulls back to keep the nose off the ground. Some pilots call that aerodynamic braking, and on some aircraft, like a fighter jet, that is a thing that can be helpful in order to preserve the brakes. Flight schools will teach pilots to do it, and I think they teach them that in order to save money on brakes. But on a commercial aircraft like this, it's a very bad decision, and it's not something you're supposed to do at all. You see here on the side of the engines, the thrust reversers are open. Now I can't tell if they are in idle reverse or actually in full reverse thrust. So technically, at a lot of airlines, the mains will touch down, the main gear in the back, those 16 tires will touch down, and you can open the thrust reversers, basically put them in idle reverse. And what that means is that the engine stops pushing you forward. It helps to slow down the plane. However, if you were to put full thrust reversers on before the nose gets onto the ground, it's extremely dangerous. And again, from the angle, I can't really tell exactly what's going on for sure. But here's a scenario. You keep the nose off the ground. What's happening is as you're keeping the nose off the ground, at some point, the wings are going to lose lift and the nose is going to end up on the ground. So I've seen pilots where they're keeping the nose off the ground and then all of a sudden they don't realize that the energy is going to run out and then it slams all that distance. So you can really damage your nose gear, but at that point, nobody on the plane is going to be really in danger of being hurt, but you could break your plane and end up in a lot of trouble. But that's not the biggest risk. The biggest risk is if you're slowing down, your rudder is losing effectiveness. So your rudder has a lot of air that's going over it while you're flying. So as you move your rudder, your plane will move back and forth. As you touch down, you can use your rudder to move back and forth because there's a lot of air going over it. However, as you start to slow down, the amount of air that is going over the rudder because you're going slower is less. And with less air going over, it's less effective. So you need your nose wheel on the ground so you can steer. Your rudder and the steering wheel on the front, the nose gear, is connected. So as you steer to the left, your rudder will move you to the left and your tire on the front, your nose gear, will also steer you to the left. So that's how that works. However, you keep your nose off and you were to have a steering problem, you don't have any way to steer if you're going too slow. If you go full reversers and number one malfunctions, you have all kinds of thrust reverse coming from the right-hand side of the plane, and you only have half coming from the left-hand side of the plane. And you have power coming off of this number one engine here. So what's going to happen is you have your right side wanting to go backwards and your left side wanting to go forward, and you have no way to steer because the plane is going so slow that the rudder isn't effective anymore. So you're just going to just go straight to the right and shoot off into the grass. And before you can, unless you slam the nose wheel down and then slam it to the left, which probably not going to happen, you're going to end up in the grass. So while this landing looks a lot worse and is definitely more dramatic and the pilot feels a lot worse, it was just a mistake. This, however, is poor aeronautical decision making, and it is a lot harder to explain to the bosses if you end up shooting your plane off into the grass or over a cliff or off a hill, which in some airports, right at the end of the runway there, it's just water. So you could end up in the water, off a cliff, a lot of things. It's a terrible decision to make and very hard to explain. The first scenario, that pilot could just get retraining. If you do this on your 747 or regular jet that's just two engines, it's less pronounced, if you will. But if you were to do that and you were to drive your plane off into the grass, it is going to be very embarrassing. You're probably going to lose your job. And if you're doing with a bunch of flight attendants on board trying to impress one of them, they're going to be a lot less impressed when they need to walk through a bunch of sloppy grass or swim out of the plane because you were trying to be fancy up there. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.